Hello and welcome to the Beef Edge, the Teagasc Beef Podcast, for all your latest news, information and advice for Irish beef farmers. I'm Catherine Egan, and on this week's episode, I'm joined by suckler farmer Michael Flynn from County Waterford to discuss his beef farm system and find out how he's managing winter fodder crops on his farm this time of year. Many farmers will be beginning to transition stock onto fodder crops over the coming days, where stock are to be grazed over the winter months. Managing this transition needs to be carefully considered. I first asked Michael, what farming system do you operate?
I operate a suckler to finish all stock. I keep about 30 cows, and I finish bulls under 16 months and heifers off grass at 24 months. I start calving in June and July.
You're bringing all stock to finish. What are your key targets for finishing the bulls under 16 months?
Well, I'll be trying to get them out early after the first winter and push them on grass and start feeding them about 4 to 6 weeks before housing, and generally try to have them housed before the end of June. And the plan would be to have them gone before animals have to come in, which is at the end of October, which has me under the 16 months.
And how much meal are you starting them on when you bring them in June?
I'd be probably building them up to 3 kilos outside and kind of keep it at a level plane for a while starting off when they're indoors until they're used with the change of diet with the silage. And
what kind of targets are you achieving on the bulls when they finish at 16 months?
Well, the last I went this year now, the average 450 kilos.
That was very, very good.
Yeah.
And what are the key targets you're achieving on the heifers that you're finishing under 24 months at grass?
Well, they average around 360 kilos. Again, it's like with the system I have as weanlings, the heifers tend to be pushed out early on grass. So generally they start at February. And then they generally are the first to be housed come the following October, and try to have them out by end of February as a year and a half. And again, start feeding them about 6 to 4 weeks, maybe more, 4 weeks before finishing. So to have them gone by June, end of June, start of July, when the calving be in full swing, so I have more ground for the cows and calves.
Michael, what is your breeding program on the farm?
I use a Shirley bull. He runs with the cows from the second or last week of August to the mid-October. With finishing bulls, I try to keep it tight as I can.
That's great. And you have been sowing fodder crops on your farm for the past number of years. These crops have a potential to serve a number of functions on the farm. Why are you sowing fodder crops?
Well, you generally use it on the fields that the grass is old or not doing well. So I use it as a system for reseeding, and also kind of once you go down the line of a forage crop, you have to reseed. So it kind of gives you a focus to pick out the fields you need to be done. Generally, I would try to pick a field close to roadways, and I find it good for animals outdoors, be healthy for the winter.
And there's often a fear among farmers as to when to start grazing it in case of nitrogen poisoning or fear that you'd run out of the fodder crop too early in the spring. How are you deciding when you're going to start grazing it this winter?
Generally, down this side of the country, there'd be a bit of grass about. So generally to the end of November, I'd be moving the animals. Again, weather dependent, and generally it would last for 2 months. So I'd be starting end of November and hopefully get to the end of January. And even if the weather wasn't right and the crop was all gone, I still would feed silage outdoors to them to maintain them until the grass was there.
And how have you managed cows grazing the crop in the past?
I would have done it in the past on occasions when I had plenty of the crop and the weather was good. And again, it was close to roadways. And that allowed me just to bring out the cows on and off grazing, like for a couple of hours, and bring them back in the evening. I did run into a problem one of the first years I did it with lameness, which make out was just due to maybe put them out on ground that was too wet. And the long walk back in on the roadway perhaps.
And you've also grazed weanlings on the fodder crops for a number of years. How have you managed weanlings on the fodder crops?
Managed well. I used to calve in the spring, so there'd be, 8-9 month old weanlings on it, and just a double strand on the reel. And once they're kind of trained into that and you've good shock, you can control them fairly well. Again, silage and meal as well.
And you mentioned having a good shock in the fence. What kind of a fence are you using?
Elephant fence, and thankfully it's a very good shock. And it seems to have worked well now the last couple of years, and I suppose just to keep the briars and whatever off it, so it's keeping from hurting. And then I generally kind of try and direct all the shock towards the field where the current is needed, and that helps as well. And
in relation to grazing it with the fence, what way do you graze the crop, on the longer side of the field or narrower side or diagonally in the field?
Generally just across the field, not necessarily the longest, more often depend on the number of animals in it, the shortest maybe. And again, you generally fields that would have ditches that would give shelter to the animals.
And this year, what do you intend to graze the fodder crop with?
In-calf heifers. I have 13 animals. They were bought in the start of August, so they were AI'd at the end of August, and then the Shirley Bull just followed up at the end to catch any repeats. Kind of from a biosecurity, and also just handy having that group together. Decided to leave them out.
And you grazed replacement heifers on that parcel as well last year. How did they perform?
They did well, as wet as the winter was. Last year I had it was 3 acres of forage rape I had, and it was in a large field that I had a kind of run back for the heifers, which I was able to get away with considering how bad the soil conditions were for a while last year.
And what difference do you think it makes keeping them outdoors versus if they were housed indoors?
Well, I think to be healthier. Like at the moment, they're still out grazing away, and they're content, and hopefully on the forage rape they remain content.
And do you find there's a lot of labour involved in using the forage rape over the winter months?
Just the daily work that needs to be done. That's probably the same amount of time we would take to do inside the house. It'd take about half an hour between shifting the wire and moving around feeder for the bales of silage.
As you start to transition these heifers from grass onto the fodder crop, how will you introduce these heifers onto the crop?
Gradually, I would give them a small amount the first couple of days, and then introduce a wider strip and onto silage then.
Total forage crop proportion of the diet, you won't be exceeding really 2/3 of the diet on a dry matter basis. And you mentioned you're going to be feeding silage. How will you feed silage?
I would have the bales already out in the field, and just a matter of moving the circular feeder onto the fresh bale each time as I move the wire.
And in relation to minerals, Michael, what do you do with regard minerals on the fodder crop?
Well, put out buckets, mineral buckets, generally kind of pre-carbon buckets that would suffice.
And you mentioned you're going to have it hopefully grazed by the end of January, but there is a risk of toxicity in the spring when the crop starts to flower. How did you manage this over the past number of years?
Well, last year I had no bother because the crop was just finished by the time the flowers were starting to come. Other years that it happened that I would have to put out, when I had the weanlings on the forage rape, I used to put out the cows. I was lucky that the weanlings were grazing from one side and I was able to bring out the cows from the shed from the other. And that got through the crop faster.
You just increase the stocking rate on it just to get through it at the very end.
Yeah.
And there's often a word of caution to be careful not to graze these fodder crops when they're frozen or when there's low temperatures. What do you do if there's freezing weather conditions in the coming months?
Well, if they're like a hard frost like this morning, I generally wouldn't feed until the afternoon and shift the wire. And if it was completely frozen like we had a couple of years ago, I would just feed silage.
Some great tips and advice there, Michael, and thanks very much for sharing your experience of grazing fodder crops over the past number of years.
No bother. Thanks.
That's all for this week's episode, and my thanks to Michael for joining me on the show. You can catch up on all other shows and interviews from the Beef Edge podcast on the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie, or you can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe so you never miss a show. For all other updates from our beef programme, keep an eye on our Twitter and Facebook pages. Until next time, I'm Catherine Egan, and thanks for listening.